Good. Hi, it's Tom Ashbrook. We're talking this morning with David Sanger. He is national security correspondent for the New York Times, longtime chief Washington correspondent for the Times, executive producer of the new HBO documentary, The Perfect Weapon. It's off of his book, The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. David Sanger has been watching everything going on the cyber front for years now, all the way back to Stuxnet and the American intervention in the Iranian nuclear program, which ushered in a new era of war by cyber. He is glued to what's going on right now on the home stretch to the election, as are we. And I want to bring him right now, bring David Sanger in to talk about where things stand and what we may see in the days right in front of us. David Sanger joins us this morning. Hi, David. Thank you very much for being with us. David, can you hear me?
Oh, now I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thanks very much for being here, David.
Sure. Tell me when we're going live, because I'm still finishing my breakfast.
Okay, well, it's the era, it's the age of live. So you're briefing the president, maybe not this president, but a normal president, on the threats between now and election day. I'd like to know what you would tell that commander-in-chief. We saw just yesterday the DNI head, John Ratcliffe, and the FBI director, Christopher Wray, come out and say Russians and Iranians are already playing around with the election, already interfering. You cover a whole range of threats, from real high-tech cyber intervention like Stuxnet, where they got right into the nuclear centrifuges. On the other end of the scale, you've got information warfare. What we just saw them describing was public voter registration records that people got hold of and allegedly sent out emails threatening people under the guise that they were Proud Boys or something, saying, go and vote, register Republican and vote for Trump. We know where you live. We'll come after you if you don't. That's pretty low tech.
Yep.
Between now and election day, the range of things that could happen seems vast, potentially, but also the potential for misrepresentation seems very large. That a campaign, the Trump campaign, could claim fraud or intervention where there was none. So set the table for us, David. How should we think about the week and a half ahead, the next 2 months, if that's how long it takes to come to a conclusion in terms of cyber threats, information warfare threats? What's the range? What are the layers?
Well, thank you, Tom, first for having me, and it's great to be back with you. So I think the way you need to think about the cyber threats between now and election day, and we'll set aside for a minute the other real world threats, there are many of them out there, but we'll get to those in a bit, is by dividing it into 2 categories. Think about the threats to infrastructure, and then think about the threats to hacking our minds. Okay.
Infrastructure, so, like nuclear power plants, water, electrical,
voting machinery.
Voting machinery. Okay.
Right. Registration stuff. Right.
Yeah.
So let's start with the infrastructure one, since you've had. You mentioned right up a big one, the utility companies, right? If you wanted to severely disrupt an election day, turn off the power in a few key precincts or states, right? If you can.
Is that doable? Do those who might have an interest in doing that?
Hard to do. Harder to do now than when you and I last discussed this topic a few years ago, but not impossible. And remember, accidents, natural disasters, whatever, they happen all the time on election days. We've had hurricanes on election days that have taken out power in parts of the country. Week ago Monday was the last day for voter registration in Virginia. And in the course of it, somebody with a backhoe went right through the telephone fiber optic cable or regular cable that connected in the Virginia Secretary of State's registration database to the rest of the state.
Accident?
Complete accident. You know, I mean, as we always say in newsrooms, whenever you see a conspiracy unfolding, do not underestimate the possibility that sheer idiocy was involved.
Yes, but that's comforting in a way, but in another way, it's not at all comforting.
That's right.
Idiocy or intervention, and how will we know? But infrastructure comes first. Who would have an interest? Who would have what range of means?
So in the infrastructure, I would say power grid, sort of first thing, right? Second order would be registration databases. It's very hard to get into the voting machines. They're offline, Tom. By and large, you might get into the programming of those machines and cause some trouble with the printout ballots. But, most of the ballots now have been printed for mail-in ballots anyway. The registration system worries me because, Tom, if you show up to go vote in suburban Boston, and they say, "Oh, Mr. Ashbrook, our records here show that 3 months ago you moved to your lovely house in Arizona, and that you're registered there." You say, "I didn't move to Arizona. I haven't been to Arizona.
Here I am. I'm standing right here."
So, if you could get into the registration databases, that's a different level of problem. Now, what do we know from 2016? We know that the Russians scanned all states' registration databases, and that they got into Arizona and Illinois.
So when you say scanned, they probed, they tested.
They probed, they tested, but they didn't actually exfiltrate data, right? In Arizona and Illinois, they exfiltrated data. And
exfiltrate means they touched it. They touched
it and took it out.
Okay.
Sucked it out. Okay. And the worry is that you then manipulate it and put it back in. Because if you got the access to go out, you probably have the access to go back in again.
Let me ask you about that, David. 20+ million people, maybe it's 30 million by now, have already voted. So if this had happened, would it already be showing up? Would we already see reports of people complaining that they were not
necessarily, because you mail in your ballot back, and then somebody gets your ballot and says, Tom sent in a mail-in ballot. Let's check him off on a different database called the e-poll book.
Okay.
Used to be when you and I were a little younger, people would just print these out. They'd check you off, like you got checked off going into a classroom.
Mine still does. When I go to the polling place, it's still on paper.
Well, that's because you live in charming old New England.
Okay.
But in some places, they do it on an iPad, they do it elsewhere, or that paper is simply something that then has to be re-entered back into the system.
Okay.
So again, a form of manipulation would be to indicate that you had already voted by mail if you hadn't. Just the check mark, because obviously they don't want you to vote twice. So there are all kinds of things one could do if you can get into those voter databases. And the answer to the question of how secure those are is that it's all over the place. The Department of Homeland Security has worked really hard for the past year to not only secure those, but get people to print them out, keep them in non-analog form. So non-digital form, a printout of some kind or something else, so that there is a way to have all this back up. You have resiliency if you're attacked. But some towns are great at this stuff, and some towns don't have a clue.
And an attacker wouldn't have to attack everywhere. They only have to attack key precincts or districts or states, or the most vulnerable ones, to raise doubt about the credibility of the whole.
That's right, which is what's taking us to what happened last night, or what was announced last night. So what you're describing, Tom, we talk about in The Perfect Weapon, in the HBO documentary.
Great documentary, by the way, running on HBO right now. David's the executive producer. It's off of his great book, The Perfect Weapon, of a few years ago. It's into great, compelling detail about all the range of threats out there on the cyber information front.
Well, thanks. And at the end of it, you may recall we have a section on perception hacks. And Chris Krebs, who runs the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, speaks on this topic. So a perception hack is, as you say, you don't have to get in everywhere. You get in a couple of places, and then you claim you've gotten in everywhere. And, for those of us who a million years ago studied nuclear theory and nuclear threats, this is like an old thing, right? You detonate a nuclear weapon someplace, maybe in the desert, and having proven that you have at least one, You then claim you have 6 more and you will set them off in 6 different American cities on the following schedule, even though you don't have 6 more. You had 1 and you blew it, right? But what you cause is such a panic in those cities that people are racing to get out of the cities, and more people die in the exit than would in any real attack, right? Or just people die.
Our country is primed for perception hack now because, in some sense, the president of the United States is executing his own perception hack.
That's
he has
right.
said that it will be fraud if he doesn't win.
That's absolutely right. And so any place where there are 2 or 3 districts that have a problem caused by the Iranians, caused by the Russians, caused by the guy with the backhoe, right? Could give an excuse for somebody to stand up, including the president, and say, see, I told you this whole thing was rigged, even if it isn't. And as I said, some stuff goes wrong every single election day.
Sure.
Right? Because you can't have a country of 330 million people spread out across 3,000 miles and not have stuff go wrong.
Yeah, of course.
Right. So, anyway, so that's the infrastructure side. The hacking of the mind side is the influence operations, the things we didn't really fully understand until after the 2016 cycle was over. So that's the Facebook and Twitter stuff. But Facebook and Twitter are around and looking for this stuff. And so if indeed it was the Iranians, I have no reason to doubt the evidence right now that there were Iranian hackers involved in this. You know,
with these emails that went out
sending
in
out
Alaska,
emails,
Texas, saying vote for Trump or we'll come after you.
Now, right. Now, this is pretty single A ball, okay? I can go down to that same town where you check off your voting rolls and look up and see that Tom is registered as a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or whatever you are. So I've got that piece of data, okay? And then I can probably go to some public website, and if not that, the dark web, you know, where criminal groups sell a lot of data, and I'll probably have your email address and maybe your physical address and maybe your cell phone number and, you know, all that kind of stuff. If I can put those 2 things together, which, by the way, political parties do all the time.
All the time, night and day.
Right? So I take 2 pieces of public and non-public data and I combine them. I've got enough to send you an email. And if I've got a stolen email domain, like the one that these seem to come from, which I think was something like Official Proud Boys or something like that, or I can hijack one, I can pretend I'm somebody I'm not. And if I can route that message through Saudi Arabia and Estonia, as it appeared happened with these emails, which is a little more sophisticated, but, you know, give me a talented 18-year-old and we'll, you know, find a way to do it. Probably a talented 13-year-old to go do this, then it makes it a little harder to trace. And all this makes for what I call the perfect weapon.
Because you can get so intimately targeted, and
because it's dirt cheap, it's easy to hide, it's highly targetable, and you can dial it up and dial it down. And let's face it, no one's going to send the 101st Airborne Division off to retaliate with a physical attack for sending some threatening emails from Iran, if that in fact turns out to be the case, to a couple of voters in Florida and Alaska.
And of course, Iran can say, look, you came in and blew up, not blew up, but screwed up our centrifuges.
They did blow them up.
They
did blow them up. They used the cyber means to blow them up. That's exactly what they did.
We can fool around with your Alaska voter registration a little bit, and it's fair as fair.
And the beginning of the documentary starts, for those who have forgotten it, with the Stuxnet attacks, which, believe it or not, are now 10 years old.
10 years. I was thinking half a dozen years, but 10 years.
It was 10 years ago that we discovered it. They started really about 13 years ago.
Yeah.
And you know, it's been fascinating getting out talking about the documentary, because like I inhaled Stuxnet, which was codenamed Olympic Games.
I remember you were deep
broke
in it
a lot
and
of
broke
parts
so much of the news.
story, and had a 4-year-long FBI leak investigation to, you know, for my sins. and so forth and so on. But we've got a generation of college students who were 8, 9, 10 years old at the time, and I mentioned Stuxnet, and I get blank stares. And not
so we should be very clear, David. This was when Iran was surging forward with its nuclear program, and the United States, through very sophisticated means, got into the centrifuges that were key to that program
with Israel.
Messed around with them in a way that sabotaged them. The Iranians didn't know it for a long time, but it dealt a huge blow to the Iranian nuclear program. And as you say in the book and in the documentary, this was, in a way, the first cyber act of war. And it was the United States against Iran.
It was the first cyber act of state-on-state conflict.
Well, okay.
Whether it was an act of war is another question. Because as we take you through the documentary, the Iranians then took out 30,000 computers at Saudi Aramco, and then went after the banking system and financial system stuff here in the United States in 2012. I didn't notice that we declared war on them. Right?
No, but we're on new terrain here, and before this century is over, I think that definition may very well cover this, and this may be a lot of the main action.
Before this decade is over.
Okay.
it may well, I think, and in fact, we have seen one case in Israel of a Hamas group that went after, with a cyber attack, the Israeli Self-Defense Force, and they responded by taking out a building that they believe the hackers were in. But by and large, what's happened in the cyber realm so far, Tom, is that people have been very careful to calibrate their attacks so that they wouldn't go above that threshold of military action. And so in both the book and the documentary, I describe this as a short of war terrain, right? Where
But just. And
one day somebody's going to miscalculate. And, maybe the president will declare tomorrow that the Iranians miscalculated with this one, because as I noticed with Donald Trump, he didn't have a lot of patience for the Iranians.
Let's look at the framework here, though, David. We're rolling along through a lot of the Trump presidency with a kind of a yearning for a status quo ante of stability. But things have changed and eroded a lot under this president on many fronts. And right now, if you were someone who did not wish American democracy well, and you were looking at how tenuous our political stability is, how vulnerable our national sense of groundedness may be in more widely than we'd like to think, this next couple of weeks or months could be an amazingly inviting time to really unsettle this country. It's been so long since we've had a real attack that we don't think about it as a real possibility. But you're a national security correspondent. Does somebody out there, if you were looking for a moment to really unsettle this country, it looks to me like the next couple of months would be a very inviting window.
Could well be. I mean, we have two types of threats over the next few months, and particularly in those 3 months between Election Day and Inauguration Day, no matter who wins. The first threat is domestic. Our greatest divisions are internal. And the reason that all those perception hacks work, and the reason that we're arguing here about whether the Russians can influence things and whether Donald Trump has been tough enough on Russia and whether or not he's looking for an excuse to declare that the election was fraudulent, is that we are so divided internally that that's the biggest source of our weakness right now.
Though, as you and others point out, that division itself may be in no small part the fruit of a lot of perception hacking from abroad. Russia in 2016 went to town on magnifying those divisions and that polarization, and presumably hasn't stopped.
We've made it, Tom, so much easier for the Russians this time. Think of it. Last time you had to sit inside the Internet Research Agency and think up, interesting campaigns. Oh, I know, I'll, I'll organize a Black Lives Matter protest in Dallas,
across the street from,
and then I'll organize, using another set of things, a counter protest, and see if I can get people to actually show up in the street and go after each other. Okay, so that's right. But you know, or I'll call for Texas secession, or you know, whatever else they were doing on there. What we've seen this year is the Internet Research Agency doesn't seem to be as busy. I don't know, those guys must be taking like a beach vacation, or they're working from home. Or
are we talking about the one in St. Petersburg?
we're talking about the one in St. Petersburg, right?
Okay, this is the building. Everybody's seen pictures, this sort of drab square, I don't know, 6-story building where all kinds of mischief came out of.
That's right. I think they've moved since then. They probably, I'm not entirely sure these guys pay their rent quite as regularly as they should. But anyway, but they
I'm sure Putin will pay it for them.
Yeah, that's right. You'll see the building in the documentary as we track through, and some pictures from inside.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
But the fact of the matter is that this election cycle, what we're seeing the Russians do largely is amplifying the president's own messaging. If the president says mail-in ballots are inherently fraudulent, guess what they're putting out on their channels? Mail-in ballots are inherently fraudulent. And if you can, rather than pretend to be Tom Ashbrook's neighbor in Boston, if you instead can infect their neighbors with that thinking, then they are real, authentic Americans exercising their First Amendment rights when they go on Facebook and say mail-in ballots are fraudulent, even if there's no evidence that that's the case.
This is the ideal hack. You're inside the machinery of our minds, and maybe inside the machinery of the president's mind, more than maybe, I guess, maybe pulling levers in there.
It could be, but you know, the president's message just gets amplified, and you know, you've got to be a little bit careful in what you're pulling down, because we have a tradition in this country rooted in presidential elections since 1788 of having a maximum amount of leeway for political speech. Okay?
Amen.
And so, Tom, if you've got a relative who believes in the QAnon theory, right, or believes that that these ballots are inherently fraudulent, you may not want to invite them to Thanksgiving dinner in a month and listen to all that stuff, but you wouldn't deny that they've got a First Amendment right to go utter it. Now, that doesn't mean
it's an old and Central American liberty, but it's never been in this same chemistry before, with unceasing kind of manipulation and maybe aggravation of the national mind from abroad. So a lot of this we know we have in ourselves, but the amplification, the magnification, this is with plenty of means to do it. Facebook, Twitter, you name it, all over the place. Reddit. This is new. This takes us onto new terrain.
It does. And let's remember, your First Amendment right is a right that the government cannot censor you. Okay? That is not a right that Facebook or Twitter can't, right? Facebook or Twitter can determine that you are in violation of whatever their rules of engagement are here. And, you know, if, you know, we're on Facebook Live here, and if you started spewing out, you know, Holocaust theories, or I started spewing out QAnon theories, it's entirely possible that Facebook might decide it violated their norms and pull it down.
Maybe, and maybe not. They've been pretty liberal about that. They've been pretty open about that. Of course, their business model favors controversy and favors all that exchange. But let's just say, all right, the ground has been set. We were a polarized nation. We're even more polarized now. We know that there's been intervention from abroad in magnifying and amplifying this polarization. Now that's the ground, the kind of swampy ground we stand on. But then let's come back to this next week and a half up to election day, and then beyond, and vulnerability, which can go all the way from your perception hack notion, which is so potent, to really bearing in on this country in a way that would unsettle us physically, mentally. And
sure.
So what I hope
what could happen
is prepare people in this conversation for what could happen, not to stoke paranoia, but to stoke a strength of readiness for whatever may come.
Okay, so you could see a stoking of internal dissent depending on the outcome of the election. If it's a big decisive outcome, I think that's a lot less likely than if it's a very close outcome. You could have foreign powers that decide that they want to use this moment of transition to mess around. China could decide to go after Taiwan or make more claims in the South China Sea. Iran could decide this is a good moment to go challenge the United States and others for something else, in the Persian Gulf, trigger an incident, so forth and so on. We got a lot of adversaries in the world, and they're thinking about when the United States will act decisively or not. And obviously, moments of transition are always fraught, right? Because if they think you're distracted, it could well be that, Putin decides that what he did in Crimea could be replicated someplace else in some other Russian-speaking corner of the former Soviet Union, and, try to annex or mess around with another piece of territory. He's already making a lot of trouble in Ukraine and Belarus and so forth.
All those are unsettling, and some of them could get into really serious territory. Taiwan, I don't know what that would precipitate if China made some moves there. I think just as much, and by the way, viewers, you can put your questions to David Sanger, your comments. I've got a screen right here. Here's Sawanta saying, we missed you, Tom, missed you too. Bring them on, bring your questions, bring your comments, and we'll share them with David Sanger. He's executive producer of the new HBO documentary, terrific documentary, The Perfect Weapon. He's national security correspondent for the New York Times. He's all over the threats to the United States that come in particular from the information and cyber warfare front. It seems to me that the greater concern is if there were things targeted, there were efforts targeted cyber information wise at further disrupting American unity during this time, because we say transition as if this were a normal election, and where we pat ourselves on the back every 4 years, how we peacefully hand off the baton of leadership to a new leader and have for 2 centuries plus. This time, we could have a big Trump or Biden win and Trump just leaves, or we could have the sitting president disputing in every way, every day, the outcome, and great national uncertainty about who's in charge or who will be in charge or how the transition is even going to happen. I mean, I wonder at that point, are there big guns of intervention in perception or in the life of the nation that you could see being rolled out by Russia, Iran, China, you name it, to say, this is the time to really have America tear itself to pieces, and we're going to step it up to help?
Yeah, I mean, I think the disinformation campaigns that come after the election could be more important than anything that comes before the election. I think one characteristic of this election is whether you like Donald Trump or you don't like Donald Trump, perceptions about him and his performance in office are pretty well set. We don't see a huge number in the polling of undecided voters. I mean, there are some out there, but if you haven't made up your mind by now that you either like what you see or you don't, the chances you're going to make up your mind in the next 10 days are, relatively small. However, if it is a close election, or there are big points of dispute in key states that contain vital electoral votes that could swing the difference, yeah, I suspect you're going to see disinformation campaigns in one way or the other, and they may be contradictory. The CIA estimate is that Russia strongly favors Trump and that China favors Biden. That could be right. I'm not completely persuaded in either of those cases. I think the Russians may well conclude that the one thing they want the most is relief from American sanctions, and Donald Trump can't get that for them.
Because he's seen as their puppet, so he can't do it.
He can, and that he couldn't even do it in a Republican-controlled environment 2 years ago. right?
Mhm.
When the Republicans voted against lifting sanctions.
Mhm.
So I'm not entirely sure that they're persuaded that another 4 years of Trump is,
Maybe
necessarily.
they've maxed out with Trump. Yeah.
And for the Chinese, it strikes me that there's a competition between President Trump and former Vice President Biden to demonstrate who can be tougher on China. So I'm not persuaded that they think life is going to be any better in a Biden administration than it's been in a Trump administration. So what they do have in common, though, is a desire to trigger enough chaos that we come to question our fundamental democratic values that we have in their minds lorded over the rest of the world and used as a source of our soft power over their authoritarian systems.
I mean, they've already seen a lot of the world's deep disillusionment with American democracy after the last 4 or 5 years. So in some ways, a lot of that has already happened.
That's absolutely right. Hey, Tom, I see the sun has shifted since we have talked. And as you can see, it's bleaching out part of my face. So if you give me just a moment, I'm going to flip this around to a place where I'm a little bit easier for you to see me. Okay.
We're live. We're
while you garner your questions, I will do a little shift.
All right. Well, we've got a lot coming in here. Let's see. All right. Here's from Julie. Anonymous. You've still got me in your ears, David. Julie's asking about Anonymous. So this goes back to 2016, I guess. Could they be helping in the background? Oh, helping us. The group Anonymous, this is a group of hackers. Do you see them as playing a role anymore? I haven't heard about Anonymous in a while. They used to come out and champion the downtrodden or whoever they thought was downtrodden, I guess. Are there, I mean, we have seen, answer Julia on Anonymous, I say we also have seen just in the last couple of weeks, Microsoft came out, I think in a coordinated counterattack with the government against this trick bot network.
Right.
So there are non-governmental actors who are part of this whole sort of war under the covers. David, describe that range of players from Microsoft to Anonymous to whoever else is out there.
So Anonymous was, as you say, a hack and leak kind of group. Again, nothing terribly sophisticated, and we are all much more attuned to the risk of hacked documents that are leaked at the last moment. And we're not rushing to go repeat stuff that we can't figure out whether or not it's genuine. And if you're looking for evidence of that, just look at how the world handled the New York Post stories about Hunter Biden last week, where the provenance of the emails is still somewhat in question. Quite in question, where the New York Post reporters, or at least some of them, wouldn't put their bylines in the story because they didn't understand enough about where it was. Where, if you believe the accounts we've seen, the first effort was to leak it to Fox News, and Fox wouldn't take it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And at least in mainstream media, the story has received very little traction, though there's a lot of media that's not mainstream media these days. So
that's right.
At the margins, these things can still work.
So that's sort of on the anonymous side. What you were referring to that Microsoft and US Cyber Command were doing, now that's a really interesting example because it goes back to what we were discussing before about infrastructure.
Lay it out for us. What is TrickBot?
Okay, so TrickBot is a set of tools, very sophisticated tools, that have been put together by Russian-speaking, we don't know if they are Russian people, but Russian-speaking cyber criminals. And those tools are used for some of the most effective ransomware that we've seen. And ransomware, to remind everybody, is when somebody goes into your computer network, locks up all your data, and then sends you a note and says, if you want your data unlocked, send 1,000 Bitcoin to this anonymous address. Okay? So far, we have not seen that used against election infrastructure. But we have seen cities and towns across America get their stuff locked up.
Baltimore got hit very hard.
Baltimore, Atlanta, before Baltimore happened. Little towns in Florida. The smaller the towns, the less likely they have much internet security in their government stuff, maybe the easier they are to get it. Or some of them just rent out, but basically they hire a company to run their infrastructure for a number of different towns, and the attack is on the company, not on the towns, but it's the towns. Some towns have paid the money to get their data.
So does or did TrickBot have the capacity to come in and hold the US elections to ransom?
That was exactly the fear, that the same infrastructure that was being used against these cities and towns could be slightly redirected at the election infrastructure. And there was a little election infrastructure hit, but it seemed to be mostly collateral damage because a town may have kept some of its voter rolls on the same server that it was keeping its parking tickets or its building permits or something like that. Okay. But it doesn't look like anybody actually aimed anything at the, right. So now the big concern is this. So what did the Cyber Command do? It went in and did a kind of preemptive attack on the TrickBot servers all over the world.
How many? How big a deal was that?
Now, well, we've identified, more than a dozen servers in places that, range from Kyrgyzstan to Brazil.
Okay.
Okay. So they're all over the place. And Microsoft did something that I suspect was even more effective, which was that it went and got court orders using a method that it's been refining in the past few years against a lot of these servers and against TrickBot, because TrickBot uses some of the Microsoft Office infrastructure, and they were able to use copyright and trademark violation and so forth as the wedge in to seize these IP addresses, right, and be able to redirect them. So the idea is cause enough disruption in the TrickBot infrastructure that they have to focus on staying online, not on launching attacks.
So Microsoft, were they sort of deputized by US Cyber Command, which is part of the Army, I guess, to go do this? Or was it coordinated with the federal government, or did they just do it?
They just went and did it. They talked to each other on the side, but they did not appear in this case to coordinate deeply. And they are not, Cyber Command is not part of the Army.
Okay.
The Army is part of Cyber Command. Okay.
What? No, wait. The U.S. Army is under the U.S. Cyber Command?
U.S. Army Cyber
is
under U.S. Cyber Command.
Okay.
Fleet Cyber, the Navy's part of it, is under U.S. Cyber Command.
Okay.
Air Force Cyber is under U.S. Cyber Command. So what you have to remember is we have, Northern Command that defends the United States, Central Command that deals with the Middle East, Space Command that you've heard so much about from the president that deals in space. Cyber Command is an equivalent command. It doesn't get the publicity that Space Command did. It was created before Space Command came along. It is growing very quickly. And one of the things we discovered as we were talking to people about the documentary, when they watch it, it came out last Friday, is most Americans don't even know it exists.
You don't hear much about it. So let me ask you this. Let's say that on or before Election Day, or not long after, in a moment of disputed outcome, first there's intervention around, or alleged intervention, or some evidence of intervention around the election itself, voting, registration, you name it. After or during, we see infrastructure attacks, maybe on the voting infrastructure, maybe on electrical, maybe on big crazy stuff, water, or even nuclear, just to unsettle the country. Does US Cyber Command swing into action then? What does that mean? Are we going to see them walk across Lafayette Square, the head of US Cyber Command, with Donald Trump announcing that the country is under attack, we're at war? I don't know. None of these things seem entirely out of the question since General Milley went across.
That's right. So the head of US Cyber Command, fascinating guy named General Paul Nakasone, probably one of the most experienced cyber warriors in the US military.
Smart guy.
Very smart guy, has been keeping a very low profile.
Yes, I haven't heard a whiff of him.
He has one of the few intelligence officials who Donald Trump, to my view, has never gone after on his Twitter account. right?
Okay.
Right? But he's running the National Security Agency, which is the civilian side and one of the largest of the intelligence agencies, far bigger than the CIA.
Yep.
In terms of numbers of people and so forth. And he's running US Cyber Command. So he's a 4-star who's got a military post running Cyber Command, and the NSA, which is of course the Signals Intelligence Agency.
Mm-hmm.
So to your analogy here, if we see these attacks, so one of the things that General Nakasone has brought about, and we describe at some length in the documentary and in the book, is the concept of persistent engagement, or some people call it active defense. And what it means is you don't wait for the Russians to come inside your water supply or your utility. Mm-hmm. You go out and put code in advance in foreign networks all around the world, kind of preparing the battlefield.
Meaning, so that you could go after you could go after their water, or you could disrupt their capacity to come after ours.
Both. And with that node that is inside their system, you can sit and do surveillance, mm-hmm. or you can do an attack. Think of it as the port that a doctor might put in a cancer patient, right? You can put that in to go detect things and see if the cancer is grown and so forth, or you can put it in to inject chemotherapy, right? You can do both. And that is what this persistent engagement is about. So in the 2018 midterm elections, what did Cyber Command do? They went into the Internet Research Agency, that group in St. Petersburg we were talking about a few minutes ago, and they brought them down for the days right around the election.
They literally more or less shut them down.
Shut them down.
Cyber attack.
Right, right. And they sent text messages to the cell phones of IRA and members of the Russian military intelligence, the GRU.
Who said IRA? What do you mean by IRA?
The Internet Research Agency.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right, and the GRU, which is the military intelligence unit, that basically said, "Hey,
we see you. We
have your cell phone number. We see," very much like those messages that people were just getting in Florida and Alaska, right?
Right.
"We know what you're up to. We're watching you, and don't mess with us." Purely psychological operation. Okay. But it was a bit of a disruption of their system. And we are looking very carefully to see what it is that they unfold in these next 2 weeks, if anything, to keep the Iranians, the Russians, anybody else who might mess around from doing this.
Are they embedded everywhere with all the potential players? Is there some Dr. No out there who's beyond their reach, but yet could be a player?
I'm sure, Tom, they're not embedded everywhere they want to be, because if you're a military operation like that, you want to be everywhere, right? The question is, are they embedded in all the right places? And the effort is to keep from a repeat of 2016, when we basically had our radar turned off. Cyber Command at that time in 2016, the last year of the Obama administration, was primarily focused on something called Project Ares, which was the effort to bring down ISIS, the Islamic State, right? And they didn't have a lot of resources focused on the election. We didn't really have the imagination that the Russians would do what they did. The posture 4 years later looks very different.
Does the United States, as vast as the NSA is and Nakasone's command is, does it have the capacity to really throttle this? And is it possible that some player out there might say, well, okay, you may come back and hit me, but when am I ever going to have a chance like this again with a president like Donald Trump, with this degree of unease, uncertainty, paranoia in the United States? There's never going to be a juicier target than right now. I'm going to do it anyway.
So we've evolved a lot in our offensive capability. And so now General Nakasone is into places that they couldn't have imagined 4 years being into. The Russians the Iranians and others, they've evolved too. It's not like they were sitting around waiting to play the same playbook they played in 2016. They know for sure that's the one thing that won't work, right? Because people would see them coming. So what have the Russians done? One thing they've done is they put more of their data on servers here in the United States. Why is that a particularly brilliant move? Because as you and I have discussed in the past, US intelligence agencies are forbidden by law for very good reason from operating inside the borders of the United States.
So when you say they put their data here, does that mean that their intervention capacity is also here? Is the data the same as cyber muscle?
Supposing I had a program that could do good offensive operations, and I found a way to put some of it on basically rental server space in the United States. The advantage of that is I may still have to worry about the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, but the foreign intelligence services led by the NSA aren't allowed to operate inside the US for very good civil liberties.
Sure, of course.
And so they're thinking about how to take advantage of our law, our traditions to better their chances. And remember, they don't need to be up permanently. They don't need to be up everywhere. You know, you have to compare this more like a terrorist attack, right? You have to be able to hit one or two places to create a big headline.
Yeah, at the right moment.
At the right moment.
And we're coming up on that moment. If something happened, would it be traceable if it's in the United States? If they've rented, if they got their data here already, you get back into that dilemma of, oh, this is outrageous. Who did this? No idea. China, Russia, Iran, you know, no idea. Are we going to end up back in that situation? Remember back in 2016, Donald Trump, he would say this, you know, oh, you don't know who could have, anybody could have done this. A 400-pound guy in the basement could have done this.
Guy
anybody could have done this. It's a way of kind of, you make everyone feel helpless once you assert that there's no way to know who did it.
That's right. Attribution is a problem because it takes a while. But I thought last night's events were pretty interesting. It didn't take them very long to go identify this stuff is coming from Iran, right?
You mean when Radcliffe and Christopher Wray came out to talk about this threat?
Which tells you that the US could well have been, I don't know for a fact, inside some of those networks earlier on, and were able to track this back and do the attribution in a matter of hours instead of days, weeks, or months. Compare it to 2012, when the Iranians came into the financial systems and wrote all kinds of havoc.
Yeah.
And it took months just to figure out it was coming from Iran. Okay. Now, why would Wray and Radcliffe make this announcement? Well, one possibility is you could say Radcliffe in particular is a partisan appointee and was interested in fingering the Iranians instead of the Russians. We'll have to all figure out whether that was the case. But the other possibility is that they were warned that more was coming, and that they thought that an early announcement of this might scare off future attacks. And that's exactly where our sources led us yesterday.
It was interesting when the FBI director and the director of national intelligence stood next to each other yesterday. The DNI, John Radcliffe, said these attacks were against Donald Trump, against the candidacy for re-election of Donald Trump. Wray did not say that. If something should happen in the next 2 weeks, in the next 2 months, 3 months, how will we know what interpretation to trust? It seemed Radcliffe is a partisan appointee.
Sure.
His analysis could easily have been seen as partisan when they made this announcement. I don't know, but against Trump, well, maybe not. But
I don't know. I mean, it's very possible if you're an elderly voter in Florida and you receive this threatening message that you don't go to the polls at all, or, the message outright said, we will know if you didn't vote for Donald Trump, so maybe you wouldn't vote for Joe Biden.
Or maybe you're outraged that somebody tried to tell you what to do and you go vote for Biden. It could go in lots of directions, but he interpreted it one way. If things happen in the next 3 months that we don't understand, but yet Ratcliffe steps up to interpret them to the nation,
and you'll
as Attorney General Barr did with the Mueller report.
That's right.
How will we know who to trust in terms of interpreting what's happening?
Well, you'll notice that in our story, in the New York Times story on this morning,
yes,
we were very careful to say it was not at all clear that this would necessarily redound to Donald Trump's benefit or harm.
I did see that.
You could imagine this going any of a number of ways. And you know what? It's entirely possible that the Iranians didn't know and didn't care, that it's the chaos in the system that they're looking for more than a specific result. Because, half the time, information operations don't play out the way you expect they might.
The chaos is its own reward for countries that would like to see the discrediting of the United States and the dismantlement of American power. Of course, chaos has also sometimes been embraced here domestically as well. The president seems to deal in it sometimes. And here we are. Did you ever imagine, David, that this, go back 10 years now to Stuxnet, you were thinking about real international confrontation. Did you imagine that your specialty, what has become your specialty, would be turned around and be targeted right into the heart of the American political process?
I imagined it would be turned around and targeted at the United States, but not at the political process. So when President Obama was sitting in the Situation Room, having inherited Olympic Games, the what people consider the Stuxnet operation from the Bush administration, he said to his staff, look, one day it'll become clear that we conducted this attack. And when it does, every other country that's already attacking us or wants to attack us is going to use the fact that the United States makes use of these cyber weapons to go do it themselves. And that's exactly what's happened. We already discussed the Iranians attacked the financial systems. They also went after the Sands Casino, a great scene in the documentary, because there were
casinos.
A casino owner, not any casino owner, Sheldon Adelson, who had suggested dropping a nuclear weapon on Iran, right? The North Koreans went after Sony. Not for political.
After the film came out mocking the North Korean leader, Seth Rogen and all the rest.
Envisioning his assassination, right? A Seth Rogen movie. And in the documentary, you'll see Seth Rogen describing the debates internally about how to go deal with the North Korean intimidation. Because, Tom, as I say to people, how many documentaries have you ever seen that have Seth Rogen and Hillary Clinton discussing the same versions of the same problem?
Yours.
We have seen the Chinese use data accumulated and put together from OPM, the Marriott hack. It was really Starwood Hotels, which Marriott later acquired, Anthem Insurance, and Equifax into one giant database that they can use for all kinds of different intelligence purposes.
Right.
So I did not imagine the different ways, particularly in the information operations, that this could be used against the US. I did imagine many ways that cyber weapons themselves could be used against the US.
Who do we trust if weird, scary things start to happen on the information/cyber front to stand up and tell us, as best it's understood and known, the truth about what's going on? Will General Nakasone stand in Lafayette Square or somewhere else and speak into a microphone? Does it come back to John Ratcliffe, who's a Trump guy through and through?
So I thought it was interesting that General Nakasone was not out there yesterday. But I think that the downside of General Nakasone's very low profile is that if he did have to stand up and describe what was going on, a lot of America wouldn't recognize.
Don't know him.
Don't know
Who's this guy?
Right. The Department of Homeland Security has got very good people in it who are working on the cyber side of this and have been working to secure the election.
But it's the top that matters, right? I mean, the CDC has very good people, but they've been muffled, muted, and sidelined during our pandemic.
And the top leadership of DHS, for whom the cybersecurity and infrastructure reports, you're associating them with child separation policies, wall building, immigration issues.
Yeah.
You and the president are not thinking of them foremost in the cyber arena. So it is worrisome, and it's one reason that we've assembled at the Times, and I know other big media organizations have, big teams of people to go sift through the data.
And you have enough access from the outside to sift the data? I'm not even sure what that means. Boggles the mind.
I don't, no, we never have enough access, and we always want to see more of the raw material than we can. But we do have one advantage. In the nuclear age, most of the intelligence on this stuff was available only to the US government, right? I mean, they had the satellites, they could watch the missiles being moved around and so forth. In the cyber age, most of the intelligence gathering is happening from private companies. It's happening from, you know, CrowdStrike and Cloudflare. It's happening from Microsoft and Apple. And
you mean who are contracted by the government, or just because they get it in the process of their own business?
They're running the world's biggest networks.
Yeah.
Right? So when I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, do I call the NSA first? They're probably going to say to me, no comment, and that's off the record, right?
Yeah.
But Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit, which is the group that took down, as we were describing before, TrickBot. Google's Advanced Threats Unit. Facebook has an extremely good influence operations unit. You know, all of those. So you can piece together from non-classified monitoring of the internet a vast amount of data, some of which the US government does not have an equivalent view into. And so this is a very different reporting objective than back in the Cold War days when the US government had
it all,
monopoly on the data. And so do you remember the other day when Ratcliffe said, I'm not going to brief Congress anymore on election threats?
Yeah, yeah,
right?
unbelievable, but yes, I do.
Right. I'm looking at this saying, what world is he living in? He thinks he has a monopoly on this data. He doesn't. And as the data comes out from private groups, he's going to be forced to comment and catch up.
Amazing. New world, and it's emerging second by second. Gut feeling, David, here we are. It's what, 10 days out from the election. We've had this ripple of emails sent to, I don't know, some thousands of people. Not, you know, intervention maybe, but not a big deal. Yeah, what does your gut tell you? Do you see big information / cyber intervention still to come? Do you imagine people with fingers on triggers just watching and gauging whether, you know, it's the right moment? Or what's your gut tell you about what's ahead of us?
I don't have a strong gut on this because a lot of it depends, Tom, given the nature of this election, on whether the outcome is a big overwhelming vote one way or the other, or a close vote. Okay, because if it's a big and overwhelming vote, the information operations, what the Iranians are doing,
it'll blow by all that.
It's all going to be a really fascinating footnote that, you know, cyber study groups and universities all across America will be writing about for the next 4 years, and we'll be learning from, but won't seem at the core of things. If it's close, then you're into the kind of debates we had in 2016, where, you know, Hillary Clinton lost by what, 77,000 votes roughly in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. And we wonder, had there not been an influence campaign by the Russians, would it have made a difference? And you'll never know the answer. You'll never be able to prove an answer to that. People have opinions, but You'd have to crawl inside the minds of Americans to know the answer to that.
The difference this time, if it's close, you may have a sitting American president disputing the election, calling it a fraud, refusing to leave. In that scenario, you can imagine all kinds of run and gun play by cyber actors who say, whoa, look at this. Yeah. The US is reeling. Let's fire it up.
Right. Now, look, I think the refusal to leave possibility, while real, is a somewhat low probability event. But we've seen other low probability events happen in the Donald Trump era. In some ways, what happens after the election could be a lot more interesting than what happens in the next 12 days. Mm-hmm. And whether anything of significance happens depends in large point on whether or not the vote is really close.
You know, here you are in your cozy chair, and it's kind of Alistair Cook-like. It looks like you could tap a pipe, and it all looks so serene.
I don't smoke a pipe, but
and
yeah.
The world, I know, the world around you that you're tracking is just boiling and roiling with capacity, for all kinds of mischief at the least, and major conflict at the worst, major disruption at the worst. How you carry that all in your head so elegantly is always a source of great dazzlement and admiration from my corner, David Sanger. We're really grateful to you for sharing it. It's just great.
Great to be with you, and wonderful to chat again.
Be prepared, I think, is the motto. We'll go with the Boy Scouts and maybe Girl Scouts too motto this time. Just about anything for the time ahead. Let's hope for the best. David Sanger, 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, national security correspondent for the New York Times, executive producer of the terrific new HBO documentary, The Perfect Weapon. David, thanks so much. Great talking with you.
Thank you.
Listeners, thank you very much. And viewers, thanks for being with us. Your comments and questions are so welcome, and we'll continue to follow them. This is fantastic to have this format, fantastic to have you along. We will be back with another great interview before you know it. Thanks for being here. Bye for now.